Hello, and welcome back to Communicable, the podcast brought to you by CMI Communications, ESCMID's open access journal covering infectious diseases and clinical microbiology. My name is Angela Huttner. I'm an infectious disease doctor at the Geneva University Hospital in Switzerland and editor-in-chief of CMI Communications. I'm joined today by my co-host, Marc Bonten, fellow editor at CMI Communications, professor of molecular epidemiology of infectious diseases in Utrecht, Netherlands, and CEO of EUCAST.
Great to be here again.
Today we'll be discussing, and for the clinicians among us, demystifying EUCAST, the European Committee on Antimicrobial Susceptibility Testing, and its mysterious ways. We're thrilled to have with us two esteemed guests, Professor Christian Giske, the outgoing chairman of EUCAST, and Sören Gatermann, the newly elected chairman. Christian is professor in clinical bacteriology at Karolinska Institute, head of clinical microbiology at the same institution, deputy academic vice president, chief consultant physician in clinical bacteriology and mycology, chair of genomic medicine in Sweden, section for microbiology. And he was chair of EUCAST for 8 years until his term ended in May. Finally, I also happen to know he is an avid runner. If you wake up early enough, you might just catch him out clocking the kilometers at ESCMID Global each year.
Yeah, hi. Nice to be here.
Good. And at EUCAST, Christian is handing over his duties to Professor Sören Gatermann, who's the head of medical microbiology at the Ruhr University in Bochum in Germany. In addition to that, he's also the head of the National Reference Center for Multi-Resistant Gram-Negative rods in Germany and chairman of the German NAC. And as we found out, he's riding a road bike. Not that much running, but is he riding his bike?
But never in the morning. No, I'm not an early bird.
Excellent. Thank you.
So we now start these episodes with an icebreaker question. And for lack of a good one around ID or CM, I am going to ask the following, as I think you're all seasoned travelers. So, what is the most underrated city you have ever visited and why? And Marc, you go first.
So I spent the last 3 days in thinking what was the most underrated city. Bilbao came to mind repeatedly. I spent there a few years ago because of an ESCMID postgraduate course on vaccinations, and I really liked the atmosphere of the city. Not to forget the eating in the city. And my wife and I, we visited a very famous restaurant in the hills near Bilbao, and that made a definite long-term impression on both of us. So for me, it's Bilbao. Now, Christian, you're up.
Yes, I also had to think hard about this, and I think my response will have to be Baltimore, Maryland. The reason for this is I kind of got a weird impression of Baltimore from watching The Wire before I had ever visited Baltimore. And if you watch The Wire, you can get the impression that Baltimore is a pretty rough place. But the Bay Area is very nice and friendly. It was some great walks there. They had some fantastic bookshops, not to mention crab cakes. Nowadays, I would maybe restrict myself a bit with them, but still, it's a great place to visit. But many people do not necessarily go there because there are more famous places nearby.
Christian, I have heard this before, but always only from people who are from Baltimore. I think it's the first time I've ever heard it from somebody who's from Sweden, Stockholm, no less. So that's a very nice endorsement of a town that I do not know yet. And now maybe I'll go visit.
It feels great that I can help out the Baltimoreans in claiming their stake at the global scene. It's a great place.
And Sören?
I had a hard time thinking about that. My city would be a city in Germany, which is Leipzig. Few people know that. Maybe if you know something, you know about the composer Johann Sebastian Bach, of course, who has lived there. But there have been other composers too, like Mendelssohn, Schumann, Wagner, and even Christian Edward Grieg has studied in Leipzig. It is a very nice place. In the evenings, the restaurants are open, and in the streets you have low traffic in the city. It is underrated because all the other cities around there, like Dresden, everybody knows Dresden. They know Weimar because of Goethe. But Leipzig, I think, is a bit underrated.
And when will you be inviting me there, Søren?
Well, see, we can visit the Centre for Edward Grieg.
Good. Happy to do that. Sounds great.
Very cool. We thought we were a science podcast, but actually we're a travel podcast. For the record, my city would be Trieste, Italy. It's the city that is forever in the shadow of Venice. It's worth a visit. It's not the same thing as Venice, of course, but it's a lovely city.
So we are very grateful for the opportunity that we have to have both of you here together today because we do have some questions.
Yes, as clinicians, me and Marc, who are now far from the lab, we have questions, and some are nice and some may be more spice laden, but we promise to give the really tough questions only to Christian because Sören should be allowed to enjoy his honeymoon period.
Absolutely, that's fair.
Thanks.
Don't worry, Christian, you'll get nice questions too. So here's the one to start with. What things are you most proud of doing in these 8 years at UCAST?
I think probably some of the things people are most upset about, not because I like to upset people, but because I felt that when I took over the responsibility for UCAST in 2016, I felt that we had come a long way in establishing a fairly all-covering AST system in a fairly short time, but still there were quite a number of logical flaws and things that had disturbed me over the years and that I wanted to address. And I think some of them I managed to resolve, but maybe not in the most popular way. I think some of the most notable things are the terrible mess of the SIR definition, which was extremely confusing in the past and actually implied that we only had an S category and the rest was regarded no touch, basically, which was, I think, very bad from a stewardship point of view. Another thing which I thought was very good was that we revisited many of the first breakpoints that we had set for some of the old agents, and we managed to come up with a way of describing some breakpoints with a caveat, where we wanted to preserve the agent as a potential treatment option, while at the same time warning that the agent was probably not efficacious enough on its own. And we did this trick of bracketing the breakpoints, and I thought that this was a good way forward. And while we were addressing some of these old breakpoints, I think we also at the same time had, at least for parts of the period, a fairly high activity with novel antimicrobials that we also had to assess. And we had to keep up the activity during the pandemic when people were not very interested in AST. So I think those are among the things I felt quite happy about in terms of what was done over these 8 years.
From my side, I would ask you, Christian, what are some things you think now you should have done differently or could have done differently?
I think one of the key problems is communicating complex messages and getting it across to all the key stakeholders and beyond, and how to do this in the most effective way. And I think one thing that cannot be underestimated is that if you reuse an old label but give it a new definition or a new content, this is always going to be challenging. Going back to the SIR definition, probably we might have been better served by giving the I group a new label, which was actually at that time suggested and considered very strongly. We decided not to go there because it was also complicated to do this in different commercial systems and so forth. So for that reason, we wanted to remain with the same letter, but give it a new content. But I still think this is very complicated. First, you need to unlearn and understand that this is not the same as it used to be. And then you need to learn the new content. And that might have been one of those things that, might have been redone. I'm sure there would have been other problems if we had introduced a new letter, for instance, for the I group, but maybe it would still have been preferable to have a more rapid transition of this. And I think also without the pandemic, maybe it would have been easier to implement it as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Christian, still staying with you, here comes some potentially tough questions from the clinician perspective. One of them comes from our fellow editor at CMI Comms, Josh Davis, who is a sometime co-host. He's not with us today, but he had a question for you. So he says, look, some pretty major changes have been made in EUCAST guidances, and it looks to us like these changes are not always based on clinical data, but primarily on PK/PD data. Yet we know that theoretical and in vitro constructs often turn out to be wrong when they're tested in randomized controlled trials. For example, there are no longer any breakpoints for Genta and Pseudomonas, based on the theoretical idea that PK/PD predicts it's unlikely to be effective. But clinically, we know it is. Now we can't use it because our labs won't report it. And a lot of small hospitals don't stock tobramycin, so we don't always have a really suitable alternative. What would you say, Christian, to that?
It's a good question. First of all, I would like to say a little bit on how we set clinical breakpoints. PKPD is definitely one of the tools we are using. We are also considering suitable places to set the cutoff from the reproducibility point of view, that it should not cut into what we call the wild type distribution, the strains with no resistance mechanisms. But obviously, what we want to have and what we do have for the new agents is a relationship between antimicrobial exposure and clinical outcome. The problem is that this is, for many of the old agents, not really available at a very useful type of level, you could say, because either it might be poor from a methodological standpoint, that you cannot really assess the MIC values that have been used. So what we normally can say from clinical data is, so the strains without resistance mechanisms seem to do fine, and those that have some significant resistance mechanisms do not always fail, of course, but are more likely to fail. That's the type of level of evidence we typically usually have. And in that tricky area between those two populations, those that are fully susceptible and those that are clearly resistant, this is where the difficulties are. And this is where the clinical data quite often is not as informative as we would like it to be for the old agents. I think we have an entirely different situation with the new agents, where we tend to emphasize the clinical data a lot. But the reason why we don't for the old agents is usually not because we don't want to assess the clinical data, but rather because we think it's absent or of poor quality. And in the case of aminoglycosides, we even used some of the literature reviews that have been done over the years on clinical data, and we found that in support of monotherapy with aminoglycoside, there was only really clinical support that this works in urinary tract focus. With regards to the specific question on Genta and Pseudomonas, I would say clearly Pseudomonas is not very in vitro susceptible to Genta as compared to what it is to other aminoglycosides. Whether it could still be used in combination therapy is possible, but we couldn't really find any evidence for that either. But what I always tend to emphasize is that we are never in a position where we say that we always got it right. So if we missed out on some very significant pieces of clinical data, we are very happy to reassess. It's not like we feel that we need to protect our initial decision or assessment. But in the case of Pseudomonas and Genta, I'm afraid I didn't really find any very compelling clinical evidence to suggest that this could be used at least in monotherapy. I would love to discuss more with Josh on which cases he was mostly referring to, because I think the only way we can really learn and improve is by discussing those tricky parts and where we had to make some assessments that we needed to make, maybe from more in vitro data, but this is not where we actually want to be. We want to have high quality clinical data to make the assessments.
And then to stay a little bit in the area of the Pseudomonas and also the complaining ID, doctors, rofloxacin, and this is a question to Sören, is now reported only as intermediate for Pseudomonas, where clinicians clinically see effective treatment, effectively as it is burst sensitive. And in some hospitals, this is claimed to lead to extra ID consultation and also for delays from IV to oral switch. And again, similar problems we've heard with ceftazidime now being labeled as intermediate for Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and some of us really prefer to give ceftazidime as opposed to piptazo or meropenem because it's important from a stewardship perspective. Sören, would there be a way in the future to more fully integrate both PK/PD and clinical data in order to avoid these circumstances where people have to adjust practices that they have learned and that they are using for many years?
There actually is no intermediate anymore in EUCAST. The term intermediate has been abandoned, and the I now is susceptible, increased exposure. And this normally, in most cases, this translates to using a higher dose. So if there's an I for Pseudomonas in ciprofloxacin, you should use the high dose, which is 400 milligrams times 3. And the same goes for ceftazidime. Ceftazidime has two listed dosages. One is 1 grams times 3, and the other is 2 grams times 3. And for Pseudomonas, you should use the high dose. This is what is conveyed by using the letter I. This is just a recommendation for a dose. So this does not mean that you should not use, and this is not only an intermediate, it is just a recommendation for a dose. Many intensivists will use the high dose for Pseudomonas anyway. For them, nothing has changed. So it is just a dose recommendation, and it's not a downgrading, but it is still a susceptible.
Now I realize that actually EUCAST is following European politics. The middle ground has disappeared. So it's either left or right side. And if you're confronted, if you want to, you have to just shout louder to get your effect. So that's very reassuring.
Well,
Can I add something here? Sorry, Søren,
yes,
please.
yes, of course.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that actually before we introduced the I group for Pseudomonas, for a long time we had a comment stating that the breakpoint applied to high dose therapy. Maybe that message didn't really get through properly because people were unable to convey that message in the laboratory information systems. So the information kind of got lost. And this was a way of trying to steer people into Pseudomonas dosing regimens to avoid that there was too low exposure. What I can say also as an example of how you can do stewardship from the laboratory perspective is that we noticed this problem that you are referring to, Marc, that people tended to, you have an antibiogram, you may have some R's, but mostly I's, and then you have one S, which is meropenem. And then people tend to want to go to meropenem. So what we did, we suppressed the reporting of meropenem. So that was never included in the antibiogram, so they had only I's and R's to select from. And then we had comments to explain that. And I think if people see an S, they are much less likely to read a comment. But if they see that they seem to be in trouble, they might be more inclined to read it or to phone the laboratory so you can have a dialogue and explain better what it means. And then I think you additionally need also educational efforts at every hospital level, essentially. But that's just an example of how you can mitigate that effect if you want.
We try to convince people that they should go to the clinicians, should go out to all the hospitals and tell them that the I is just a dosing recommendation. I'm no longer counting how many talks I gave on this topic. Education is always difficult. If you remember what you had before, then you had an I which was actually meaningless because the I had different meanings. It could be just you can use a high dose. It could mean inconclusive clinical effects or something along these lines, which I had a hard time interpreting. And it could mean a buffer zone for the laboratory. That means if the microbiologist couldn't decide, they just put an I and let the clinicians decide that. That was a very, very bad situation at that time. So this is why it was a good idea to have only one label for the I, one meaning for the I. In my opinion, Christian, this was your greatest achievement during that time, to change the labeling of the I during these 8 years. And I know that there were many people against it, and many people would have liked to keep the old label.
So for the correct clinical action is in the eye of the beholder. I pause so you can cut it out. We continue with a question for both of you. And then actually in the preparation of this podcast, when we were telling people that we were going to talk about EUCAST, this was the question that we should not forget to ask you. Can you tell us about the recent guidance on fosfomycin? It was developed in December in Christian's time and updated just a week ago. So you're both apparently were involved in this.
Yeah, very much. Yeah, I think when we engaged in fosfomycin, it was very clear that E. coli was never going to be an issue. We had several years ago looked at the oral fosfomycin, the one-dose version of it for uncomplicated UTI. It was clear that for E. coli, it made a lot of sense. It worked fine in the bladder model. It was also clear that Klebsiella didn't really work, at least not with that kind of dosing regimen. It did not look good in bladder models, and it was maybe not a good alternative. What happened meanwhile is that we started assessing a lot of PKPD, and there were also clinical trials since there were new sponsors of fosfomycin, new companies that were in this field. So suddenly we had access to data not only for the UTI variant, but also for the IV that could inform questions about dosing, about PKPD and clinical efficacy. And what was more important as well was that we also managed to get hold of a lot more MIC data. And the differences are incredibly striking in the activity of fosfomycin. If you look at strains without acquired resistance mechanisms in E. coli, they have MICs of less than or equal to 4. If you look at Klebsiella, it's 128. Pseudomonas 256, Acinetobacter either 256 or potentially 512. Staph aureus was 32, which looked fairly okay, but still not great. And this was when we started considering, could this be a situation where we introduced again a bracketed breakpoint? That means a breakpoint with a caveat that this would apply for a situation where you use it in combination therapy, that you could test it, and if it belonged to the wild type, it had no acquired resistance, then you could proceed and use it in combination therapy. And we also looked at clinical trial data, and none of it really supported having clinical breakpoints for, at least not for monotherapy of fosfomycin. But for the combination therapy, we actually also had quite a lot of communication with one of the companies manufacturing fosfomycin IV. And they did several trials, all of which were presented this year at ESCMID Global as posters, which have now been also added as references to our guidance document. And what these documents say is that in non-controlled trials, patients who get fosfomycin seem to have overall good responses if they get it in combination therapy. What we don't know is what would have happened to the patients if they didn't include fosfomycin in the combination treatment. But what was clear to us was that the clinical response was never related to an MIC. So it doesn't really make sense for the labs to test it. So it makes sense to test E. coli. And you can test and report E. coli for use in febrile UTI, for instance. No problems with that. There is a good and robust testing methods. But in all of the other situations where you could consider it for combination therapy, we don't think we can advise anyone on a testing method that would be helpful to predict that clinical efficacy in combination therapy. And as we know, this is also a very tricky field. People want to know what happens when I use agents in combination, but it's usually quite tricky to find robust tests that will help you predict this. I think that's my main take on fosfomycin. Sören, you may want to continue.
I was only responsible for the update, and the update was just the inclusion of the 3 studies that have been presented at ECCMID Global. These 3 studies, sponsored by the company, concluded that fosfomycin may be useful regardless of the MIC. This is the conclusion of all of the 3 manuscripts. It corroborates what we, before that, already put into our guidance documents. And in the situations where the MIC may be high and everything may be fine working, or in the situations where the MIC may indeed be low and the combination is not beneficial, then testing of an MIC and setting a breakpoint doesn't make any sense. Therefore, we abandoned these breakpoints and we made a guidance document on the EUCAST website that summarizes all that Christian and I have just said. This is, by the way, the typical way EUCAST does it. If there are completely unresolved questions also EUCAST cannot resolve. We do not try to find some intermediate compromise, but we just put together a guidance document that summarizes all these problems. And these may also be taken by scientists or by companies to develop new trials.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking at the guidance document right now. It's a lot of text. Busy clinicians, we want strict orders, right? We want marching orders. We don't have time, maybe, or we think we don't have time to read nuance. But it sounds like what you're saying is for fosfomycin, apart from E. coli, it's all nuance. And you'd sometimes have to take the time to read the full guidance document rather than find simple breakpoints. This guidance is very nice because the new version, thank you, Sören, has direct data from these trials. And that is something we understand as clinicians. For those who can make it that far to get to the point that they're going to open that guidance and read that text and then to the actual clinical data at the end of that guidance, it is useful. It is helpful to us. And I think we all have to sort of get comfortable with uncertainty, with nuance.
You're saying that as a clinician. And most often the clinicians will ask their microbiologist, why has fosfomycin in this case disappeared? I always think that the microbiologist should have an answer to that. At least the microbiologist should read those guidance documents to be informed, to be able to inform the clinician.
Yeah, I would say we are not at all negative to considering fosfomycin in combination therapy, although I have to say I haven't seen the evidence that adding fosfomycin leads to a superior outcome. This I don't know because we haven't seen any such data. And it's also very tricky to design this type of trial, obviously.
Christian, you will have this data. Thanks to Sandrine Marchand and Sebastian Wicher in Hamburg, I'm part of a lovely international group who have received a JPI AMR grant to do a human randomized trial that's going to compare fosfomycin as adjunctive therapy to ceftazidime. Actually, it's going to be for gram negatives for enterobacterals because, as you wonderful microbiologists have shown in the laboratory, there's this beautiful synergy between fosfomycin and ceftazidime with or without avibactam. So our job actually as one of the work packages of this big JPI AMR project is that we have to bring you these data. So we are going to randomize patients with gram-negative sepsis to either ceftazidime alone, ceftazidime with or without avibactam, because the trial will actually take place here in Geneva, where we don't have, luckily, that many resistant organisms. We don't always need the avibactam. So they will be randomized to either that as standard of care or to ceftazidime with or without the avibactam plus fosfomycin to see whether that actually is superior. We're in the middle of finalizing that protocol right now. I have a wonderful research fellow working on it. We're picking people's brains like crazy because we feel that we are sort of carrying this very important weight. We're very worried that we're in a trap, actually, because we didn't get tons of money, right? We can't include thousands of patients. We hope that clinically there will be some superiority, but we know it's going to be pretty small. The difference will probably not be huge, right? It'll be nuanced like everything. It'll be subtle, and we don't have loads of money to include, all the patients you would need to show a very clear difference, even a small one. So we're working on it right now. We're actually working intensively on how to define these outcomes. It's like a one-shot deal, right? We will be the first trial, we think, that will be looking at true clinical outcomes with this beautiful synergy we see in the lab, but we don't want to kill it, right? We don't want to kill it. We don't want to do it wrong. We don't want to dilute our population, not show the difference, basically make a type 2 error, right? We don't want to say, oh, there's no difference, when maybe there is.
I think this is very interesting. What is always difficult with these trials is there a subset of patients that would benefit from it and some that don't, and then you end up diluting it.
Yes.
And you see no clear difference, but maybe there would be some subpopulations. And then the second question to that is, is there a way with a lab test to predict situations where it would make sense and where it would not make sense? If there is a robust lab test to predict it, then it is extremely interesting, of course. And this is something we are working quite a lot on at this point, because we will have to deal potentially with some novel antimicrobials that could work in quite different ways. Maybe they are attenuating bacteria with antivirulence or other things. It's not really certain either that we will be the ones to advise on susceptibility testing of those. What are we going to look at? What will be the potential lab test that would predict efficacy in such situations? And then we are working a lot on now also with the new subcommittee on phage susceptibility testing and trying to find some way of standardizing this, which is very complicated. And as you probably already are aware of, the phages are also used in combination with antimicrobials. And is there a way we can test even that? But these are still incredibly important questions where I think we can make a huge difference.
Adding to that, you should always collect the strains, make sure
Yeah.
that you have the reference method for determining the MIC, which is different for fosfomycin than for other drugs. And then think about a test that will predict benefit. I don't say synergy, because this is a little bit different. There may be synergy, but no clinical relevant effect. A test that would predict that the combination is clinically beneficial.
Yes, it's difficult, and it's very difficult because what is clinical efficacy, right? Patients are all very different, very heterogeneous populations. No matter how hard you try to make them uniform, we're working on it. I feel a big weight, and I don't want to do it wrong. I wish we had more money. If we had tons of money, we would just include thousands of patients, and I would feel comfortable because we could always do subgroup analyses, and we could always find the right population where it really worked. But when you don't have that luxury, you really got to get it right on the first go.
As we're coming to the end of this podcast, I have a question to Sören, as taking over the role of Christian, and we've heard about Christian's achievement during his 8 years of leadership. Our question to you is, Sören, what are your top 3 priorities for the coming years as the leader of EUCAST?
Well, it has come to everybody's attention that sometimes EUCAST decisions are difficult to understand for the clinicians or for the microbiologists. So for the upcoming years, I think EUCAST, and I shall try to do that, shall try to explain those decisions a little bit more, just more intensively to everybody. And we'll do that by having courses, even with hands-on time, typically in collaboration with other groups in ESCMID. We'll have video seminars a couple of times a year that will try to explain the decisions EUCAST has made. And we have had a lot of different decisions during the last years. And I should like to invite you clinicians to participate in some of these seminars, webinars, just to convey the message, the explanations to your fellow clinicians in the hospitals. And this is, I think, one of the most important things. So I'll invite you, all the clinicians, infectious diseases specialists, to these seminars. Okay, and then the rest is technical. Update of a document for resistance mechanisms. This has to be done because we have new resistance mechanisms and more and different resistance mechanisms. And we have new techniques available to detect them. We even have new drugs. EUCAST will keep on setting breakpoints on new drugs, and we'll revise old breakpoints if new data becomes available. And then we are back to point 1. We try to explain that.
Thank you, Sören. That was a clear invitation to our professional society to, and let's stay with EUCAST, to increase the inoculum of EUCAST.
Exactly.
Marc, very nice. You're good at dad jokes, Marc. You and Josh Davis would be great co-hosts. We have to put you guys on an episode together. So one very last question from me. Sören, can you explain to an untrained audience what exactly these ECOFs are? For our listeners, ECOF stands for epidemiologic cutoff value, just in case. Even though they were introduced 20 years ago, I suspect there are plenty of people in the field who do not know what they are or how they should be used.
Well, the ECOF is actually a description of the natural distributions of the MICs of a given organism, a given species, towards a given defined antibiotic. Mathematically, it is the 97.5 percentile of the distribution. That would mean that 97.5% of a normal distribution of the wild type organism has MICs below this value. This is only a description. You can have an ECOF for every combination of an organism and a drug, even for those organisms, bacteria, that cannot be treated with this drug. Theoretically, Christian, I think we could have an ECOF for penicillin G for E. coli.
Yeah,
it would be
sure.
extremely high, though.
Yeah.
Yes, and there would be an ECOF. Now, the difference between an ECOF and a clinical breakpoint. A clinical breakpoint is what you can achieve in a patient, the exposure you can achieve in a patient. And if, let's say, you can achieve in a patient a concentration that would translate to an MIC of, let's take some number 4, and the ECOF of the organism you want to treat is a 1, then in principle you can use that drug to treat this organism, in principle. If, on the other side, you can attain a breakpoint of 4 and the ECOF is like 16, this will never work. This drug will never work in this organism. So this is the difference between clinical breakpoints and ECOFs. ECOFs are needed to set clinical breakpoints, but themselves are never, ever the clinical breakpoint. Anything I forgot, Christian? The mathematics? I don't want to talk about the mathematics behind that.
No, I think that's good. I think just to add maybe that in those examples you gave, at least it cannot be used as a standalone agent for monotherapy. It might still be useful sometimes for combination therapy.
Okay, we're now really coming to the end now. For our two guests, Christian and Sören, what are the key messages that each of you would like to make to our audience today? Christian, let's start with you.
I think the key message to make is that we like to engage with the users and stakeholders at different levels. We like to have communication. We like to receive criticism whenever it's backed up by data suggesting that we failed to consider something which was important. And that gives us a very good opportunity to also have a direct discussion about this. So I would like to say maybe one of the most important things is to have public engagement and to have people actually reading our public consultations, commenting actively on them, and contacting us whenever they think we got it wrong.
And Sören?
I can fully agree to what Christian said. I have a short message. One is a message to clinicians, as I said before. Ask EUCAST or your microbiologist the meaning of the reports, what is in the reports. Ask them and you'll get answers. And a message to microbiologists out there. Attend EUCAST sessions, attend EUCAST webinars, and ask your questions. You will have questions, very certainly. And ask your national committee, your national AST. They are there to be asked and to help you with every question you may have. And if you want that EUCAST changes something, just contact us and provide your argument, preferably, of course, flanked by some data.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, both.
Thank you so much, Sören Gatermann, now chair of EUCAST. And thank you also to Christian Giske, the outgoing chair. Thank you both for being available for this really nice moment, really nice time to see this changing of the guard. Thank you for listening to Communicable, the CMI Comms podcast. This episode was hosted by Marc, Bonten, and Angela Huttner, editors at CMI Comms, ESCMID's open access journal. It was peer-reviewed by Dr. Suzanne van Asten of Radboud University Medical Center. Theme music was composed and conducted by Joseph McDade. You can subscribe to Communicable on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, or you can find it on ESCMID's website for the CMI Comms journal. Thanks for listening and helping CMI Comms and ESCMID move the conversation in ID and clinical microbiology further along.